They dreamed of descending together into the underworld, of photographing the drowned cathedrals where time drips in stone. But the caves of Yucatan have their own rules and their own endings, and they returned only a fragment years later, as if to prove they were listening all along. Daniel and Claire Whitman were not careless people, at least not by the measure their friends used. He was 28 in the winter of 2005, a recently licensed architect with a neat desk and a map fetish. A man who folded paper the way surveyors fold it, so that creases land on lines and nothing else. She was 26, a photographer with a stubborn eye for emptiness, fogged lake at dawn, a road that refuses passengers, light falling through blinds onto an unmade bed. They married the previous July in a cedar chapel near Horseshoe Bay, where gulls heckled the vows and friends laughed. In the pictures, their faces look like two people about to start a story they believe they will author together. Someone clinked a glass and joked that their honeymoon would never end. Someone else said, half admiration and half warning, that stories like theirs sometimes confuse the map for the country. They were the kind of couple who bought secondhand backpacking gear and then spent real money on water filters and headlamps because some corners should not be cut. They kept a list on the fridge titled Long Roads and scrawled across it places that stood up in their heads when they could not sleep. Milford Sound, Lofoten, Greenland's ice, Chiapas, anywhere with caves. They had already taken themselves seriously as travelers. Nepal had taught them altitude, the throat's thinness, and the way monasteries make the sky feel not so tall. British Columbia taught them fog that moves like a living thing, kayak hulls knocking softly at night, a seal's eyes at the level of their hands. Utah, where they went for 3 days and stayed 9, taught them rocks grammar, arches and slots, the way light at noon is a lie and at evening a revelation. But they had never known caves, real caves, the kind that ask you to arrange your breath in a new order. They had watched a travel documentary once on Yucatan's cenotes, those limestone sinkholes punched clean to groundwater where trees drink with their toes and sun pours into blue. The narrator used phrases like longest underwater cave system in the world, Sac Acton, Dos Ojos, halocline shimmer, crystal clarity. The camera followed divers who glided between hanging stone like bishops through a silent nave, beams of light knifed through water so clear it looked like air. Claire paused the show and put her palm on the screen, a habit of hers when her mind had already moved ahead to how she would frame it. Daniel fetched a map and started tracing lines between Tulum and Playa del Carmen and the labels with sacred names. He Googled cavern versus cave diving. He read about the rule of thirds, 1/3 of your air to go in, 1/3 to come out, 1/3 for when plans fail, and said it out loud the way students save verbs while they're still learning them. She ordered a cheap housing for her camera and then returned it because cheap was the wrong adjective for breath and water. They promised each other caution and promised each other wonder and, possibly, made the mistake of believing those two promises always fit in the same sentence. Cenotes are mouths in the jungle. From above, the Yucatan is a flat green book with very few pages, but open it and the text runs underground for thousands of miles. Rain dissolves limestone slowly. Sea levels rise and fall. Time does what time does to anything that insists on being both rock and sponge. Where a roof collapses, a circle of sky appears, vines descend like ropes lowered from some patient god, and fresh water sits atop salt in a silent two-layered drink. To the Maya, these holes were portals to Xibalba, the underworld, a geography and a morality at once. Offerings went down, and answers came up differently than expected. Priests talked with water and stone and the dead were no less strict because of it. Archaeologists still find bones, pottery, masks, obsidian blades in dark chambers where no light belongs unless a diver brings it. Guides, even the modern ones who keep spare O-rings in a tin and wear computers on both wrists, still place a hand on the air before they descend, as if to greet a host whose house is older than the weather. Daniel and Claire arrived in Cancun on January 14th, rented a tired Nissan that coughed even when it wasn't supposed to, and drove south along Highway 307. The Caribbean kept showing itself in urgent blue and then ducking behind mangrove like a gossip. They checked into a white and blue hotel in Tulum that smelled faintly of bleach and limes, and every afternoon the lobby filled with sand that the concierge pretended not to see. They ate tacos al pastor on paper plates and stained their fingers orange and laughed like people who have not yet negotiated with heat. The ruins above the sea were full of iguanas that looked like retired generals and teenagers devising photos for people who would not understand that the wind was the actual subject. Claire shot everything. A boy with a kite in dead air, a dog sleeping under a motorbike, a woman washing plastic chairs with a hose as if she had been entrusted with a small portion of the ocean. Daniel circled cenotes on his map and pointed at each as if a finger could reach through paper to water. He asked questions in careful Spanish. People answered in generous English. Tulum had that strange mix of backpackers who will lecture you about carbon and then fly to Berlin for a DJ, and divers who can change an O-ring in the dark, by feel, and then talk for 10 minutes about how light works underwater. There are two kinds of trips into cenotes sold to the public. The first is a cavern tour, always with a guide, always within sight of daylight, along a routed circuit with a fixed guideline the color of bread dough. The second is cave, and cave is where sunlight stops existing as a concept, and training becomes the only light you can trust. The difference is not subtle, not negotiable, not something you feel out on the day. The dive shop on Avenida Tulum offered both, as most do, but separated them by tone and price in small print. The owner, a man from Veracruz with forearms like good rope and a voice tired in the way of people who have delivered the same warning for 15 years, remembers them well. They were polite, he said later. Good Spanish, better smiles. He knew some things. She knew the right questions. They wanted not tourist, their words. I told them Dos Ojos Cavern is beautiful and safe if you listen. They said they wanted real caves. He tapped a sheet of paper printed with the agency's standards and the yellow triangles that mean we've thought about lawsuits already. I told them training. They said time. I told them dangerous. They said careful. He shrugged. There is always someone. If I say no, there is always someone who will say yes. The someone who said yes was not a signed-up instructor, not a person who filed trip sheets with the port captain each morning as the reputable shops did. He was a local freelancer whose name would not appear in any official document afterward. A man who knew the jungle paths and their little holes and the places where a guide could earn 2 days' wages by making foreigners believe they had gotten away with something. He took cash. He took pride in knowing routes. He did not always take a reel. He did not always say no when money said yes. He told them to meet him at noon on the 17th at a particular speed bump beyond the Pemex on the road inland. They rented tanks and lights from the shop. They had the certification for open water and the charm for anything else, and strapped everything onto the rented scooters the way cities strap problems onto side streets. The clerk remembers them riding away, 2 cylinders clanking like bells behind a tiny engine, and the woman waving once, as if the air had applause in it. The cenote at the end of that path has a name among the people who know it, and a different one for those who don't. It is not on tourist maps. From above, it looks like a feature the jungle is still deciding whether to keep. An oval of sky where everything else is roof. A circle of cold breath in an afternoon that wants to burn. Vines hang to the water like ladders. The pool is black once the sun slides behind one particular tree. A limestone lip runs around the edge, pitted like old teeth. On a dry day, bats are audible. On a wet day, the jungle's sweating drowns them out. It opens to a tunnel within 10 meters, to a restriction within 20, and to a choice within 30 that has sent trained divers with line and redundancy and humility back to daylight. There is a way descents go when they are correct. Divers kit up on the platform, run a check by rote and aloud so that habits become non-negotiable. Mask, fins, weights, releases, air, BCD, final OK. They tie a guideline to a fixed point in daylight and pay it out like silk as they go, a white breadcrumb road to the surface in case visibility turns to theory. They carry 3 lights apiece, not because they are frightened, because they are honest. They keep their fins off the floor and their exhalations off the ceiling. They move water gently because water is the only friend you get down there, and it will leave if you bother it. They turn the dive when their pressure drops to 2/3 because math saves more divers than muscles do. Then there is the other way, the way people go when they are visitors to their own safety. Sometimes it works. Sometimes it does for almost half an hour, which is worse. What happened next exists now only as a reconstruction measured in probabilities and gouges. Witnesses on the road remember seeing 2 scooters parked at the little path, their stands set down carefully on ground that does not always hold still. A neighbor who collects palm fronds there says he heard voices speaking English, and then speaking the limited Spanish people speak when they are still turning the language over to figure out where the edges are. There were no other footprints on that path that day big enough to matter. The men who first went in after the alarm found one fin floating 10 meters inside the entrance, a rental in a size that fits a small woman. The other fin was caught between roots near the alcove where people usually pause to equalize, as if someone had hung it there on purpose and then changed their mind about purpose. No lights, no reels, no tanks left near surface as gloom offerings. The water, clear when no one moves, was milked with silt by the time the third team went in, and the first discipline in caves is to refuse to confuse motion for progress. They called the Navy. The Mexican Navy divers came with the correct gravity and the correct boxes. They are used to tourists in currents and fishermen in bad bargains. They staged cylinders, strung guideline as if they were laying cable. They dropped cookies, small directional markers, on the line at junctions in case the line came back later alone. They moved slow because slow is the only speed that makes time larger. They found the restriction at 20 meters and chose the wider branch because no one who does this work long chooses a tight passage first. They swept left where the laminar flow had carved a scalloped wall and noticed a faint scratch higher than careful fins are supposed to leave, the mark a panicked heel might make when a body tries to climb water. There was nothing that could be reported with the confidence paperwork requires. The jungle's heat crushed the surface teams. The water crushed the divers in a different way. On day 2, the Navy called in civilian cave specialists from Playa, from Acumal, from as far as Merida. Men and women who own reels the way writers own pencils. The specialists arrived without drama and with extra batteries and said, quietly to one another, "We keep our heads, and we keep these people out of our way." The guideline spiderweb grew. Markers appeared at intersections. A careful team followed the right-hand rule, around a breakdown chamber where massive boulders had fallen from a ceiling now 4 meters higher. Behind one block, a push passed through a body-width squeeze into a room as clean as a chapel. The silt there lay like untouched dust. No bubbles had scraped the ceiling. No fin had ever been rude to that floor. It was the wrong place if the object was hope. Divers turned and pressed on through the main conduit. Feeling the halocline, where fresh sits atop salt, shiver under their lights like heat haze against the ceiling. In a long tunnel, the temperature stepped down and the water grabbed the skin through neoprene like a hand on a wrist. A man from Acumal named the place for his daughter and then apologized inside his head to the cave for naming anything at all. They turned on thirds and came back. And on the surface, the mother who had arrived from Vancouver that morning asked them whether they had seen anything, and they told her the truth in a way that made truth seem like a thing you can hold with both hands. Above, the jungle did what jungle does after rain and wind. Closed, grew, remade edges. Below, air bubbles that had been breathed into domes mapped the ceiling in accident Morse. The percolation, tiny fractures of gypsum falling, snowed into the water columns so slowly that time forgot how to count. In town, the hotel clerk began to answer the same phone call in the same way every hour. The port captain stamped papers, and then stacked them, and then stamped more as if the repetition could build a bridge. The dive shop owner walked to the church and deposited enough pesos in the dish that the priest stopped him at the steps and said thank you like a person who knows both scarcity and pride. The freelance guide was nowhere anyone looked. The scooters remained parked and then were towed and stored and logged under a number because that is how the world holds what it cannot use. On the 4th day, a helicopter from the Navy flew a straight line along the jungle edge because someone high in a chair far away had drawn it with a ruler and said, "Try this." On the 5th, a pair of dogs walked from cenote mouth to cenote mouth and told their handlers with tails and noses that the world smells like water when it's all water. On the 6th, the shop owner, against his better judgment, and because someone half begged and half commanded, went back to the cenote he had already left behind and picked up a fin and turned it over and read the rental shop stamp and felt a small break somewhere private, as if a branch had come off a tree in the night. On the 7th, the Navy wrote the sentence a Navy writes when the only thing left to do is risk the divers for pride instead of reason. We suspend active search with regret. The paper beneath it filled with words whose aim was to sound like closure. The jungle around the cenote did not hear. The cave did, and kept. Back home, Vancouver did its own mathematics. 2 chairs were empty at Sunday supper. A workplace filled a desk with sticky notes that said call if you need us and meant it. The newspapers published 2 photographs, one of them in wetsuits at a lake in British Columbia laughing, and one of the cenote's mouth, green and black, and too convincingly like a throat. The articles used phrases careful and adventurous and tragic in lists that made all 3 seem like roommates. Friends explained to other friends that Daniel was not reckless, that Claire was brave in the way you are when your hand is on the shoulder of someone competent. People who had loved them spent the first week on the phone and the second week in silence. A neighbor watered their plants and then let one die and then apologized to a room that was not listening. Claire's mother read about cenotes for the first time and threw up in the sink without making a sound. Daniel's father believed there must be maps that the Navy refused to consult because there are always maps that governments refuse to consult, and he pushed his finger across atlases and made routes with a pencil like rail lines toward stations that no one had built. Stories accrete after official endings. In Tulum, the couple became a caution told with the same paragraph breaks and pauses guides use when they explained the rule of thirds and the difference between cavern and cave. In Playa, the cave divers who had participated did what divers do when they cannot shake a dive. They went back to work immediately and with more care, as if care after the fact could shift an earlier sum. At a bar in Acumal, a man said the freelance guide had taken them to a different entrance and then fled when he realized what he had done. And a woman said the freelance guide was made up to protect a shopkeeper who had bent a rule that cannot be bent without nerve endings dying. On internet forums, people who had never been within 1,000 kilometers of a halocline constructed theories as clean as ash. Some of those theories were even accurate. Others were recreational fiction. In a cenote outside Felipe Carrillo Puerto, a local woman left 3 marigolds and a coin at the lip because the dead must be fed no matter whose dead they are. In Vancouver, a candlelight vigil had too much wind and not enough candles, and the person who arranged it felt as if he had failed them a second time. Time did what time does. It moved the world forward while leaving objects in place. The caves changed because caves are not fixed. Water level breathed with rainy season and dry. A ceiling panel in one passage sheared off and raised the floor by the height of a man's chest. Another passage silted up and then reopened when hurricane water shoved fresh through like a plow through old fields. Divers pushed Sac Acton's limits until one February day a connection proved what people had suspected for a decade, that this system was longer than any other, longer than record books had been built to celebrate. Teams published maps that looked like nervous systems. Foreigners came for training and left with humility. People died who were trained and careful. People survived who were neither, because probability is not a saint. In guide briefings everywhere a story was told in the soft voice guides reserved for things that are not merely instructional. A couple from Canada entered a cave near Tulum in 2005 and were not seen again. Do not go where you cannot return from blind. 9 years later, in May 2014, a 3-person team of experienced cave divers went into a side passage of Dos Ojos that had been sketched in pencil and then ignored because the primary flow led elsewhere. Side passages are where patience goes both to die and to be rewarded. The first restriction was low and wide, the kind you answer with a side-mount shrug and a promise to be small. The second was higher and brief. The third felt less like a squeeze and more like a question measured in limestone. Do you belong? They took their time, tapped ceilings with knuckles to read the confetti of percolation and judge whether the next room had a vault. The room did. It was clean, no bubbles trapped in the roof like silver coins, no fin prints, no false snow. They hung in water that looked unoccupied and therefore holy. One diver moved his beam along the wall, across a white pocket, into a shadow. The object in that shadow did not register immediately. Many things underwater looked like bones, roots, collapsed stalagmites, the pale interstices of rock, a branch carved by flood into jointed illusion. But lights are insistences. The diver swept the beam back. A foot. He recognized it faster than he expected to. There is a way bone curves that rock cannot imitate without luck. There is a way the tibia presents the idea of a straight line even after the line has been broken by years and collision. The ankle wore a strap. It was rubber grayed by time and salt that had crept inland in hurricane years, and it was the exact artifact shape of a fin strap. They did not touch it first. They surfaced in the room's small dome because the body knows how to breathe better when it can see air even if it cannot use it. Eyes met. Someone nodded because nods survive in all languages, even underwater. They descended and filmed because procedure requires documentation if you want the dead to travel through institutions as smoothly as the living do. Later, above ground, the woman from the team would try to explain to a reporter that nothing about this felt like triumph. It felt like being told a secret you did not earn, she said. They laid a temporary line to the crevice and then laid a second because lines fail when asked to prove themselves. The forensic team came the next day with bags and quiet faces and the particular ugly tools used not to ruin what the cave did not ruin. The fragment came free with care. It was not whole. It was what water and stone had decided to release. The line of the cut was at once messy and clean. Messy because time is a blunt instrument. Clean because rock is capable of neatness when given a century. The bag was sealed. A chain of custody began with names written in slow ink. The object traveled to a lab that had seen this story before and would see it again, though every time it feels like the first sound in a room where people have been whispering. DNA said what DNA says with a voice older than passports. That this belonged to a person who had a mother and a toothbrush, that this was a Whitman, that it was Claire. The families had learned the choreography of bad telephone calls by then. Claire's people sat around a table and held hands and waited for a sentence to land. And when it did, they held their hands tighter as if they were holding a rope. Daniel's parents asked a question that no one resents because it is the only one left. Did you find him? The answer was no, and the word weighed as much as it had the first time anybody used it 9 years earlier. A journalist asked Claire's sister whether this was closure, and the sister said a sentence that deserves to be memorized. Closure is a drawer you push with your hip when your hands are full. We don't have that kind of furniture. In Vancouver, they buried what they were given. The headstone had been carved already because some families require a place to bring flowers, even when geography refuses to provide the logic for it. Now flowers landed near something heavier than grief alone. Claire's photographs leaned against the stone, an egret in a marsh, a mountain road at dusk, Daniel asleep on a bus in Laos with his mouth open, an image that made her mother laugh aloud at the graveside before crying in the correct order again. Daniel's name remained a cut with no object beneath it. His father told a reporter that if his daughter-in-law was in those tunnels, then his son was too. That water does not learn faithlessness after the fact. Theories, after evidence, become less recreational. Cave divers reconstructed a path in which the couple, guided poorly or not at all, entered on the wrong promise, laid no primary reel from daylight, and followed a natural line instead of a physical one. The entrance tunnel pitched to a restriction. They passed by habit rather than confidence, still in sight of enough glow to call it day. A halocline shimmered as fresh met salt and turned the world into wobble glass. A hand reached out to steady the universe and struck a ceiling. Silt lifted in sheets, the way flour leaps when a cook is careless with the bag. A light may have failed. A second may have stood by but aimed elsewhere. A third, if there was a third, may have been off because third lights get treated like mascots by the inexperienced. They may have finned harder, which is worse. The guide, if there was a guide, may have been ahead and then not ahead and then not anything at all. Gas management, once an idea, became a denominator. Panic, a bad mathematician, began to do its work. One tried a narrow crack, shoulders turned, tank scraped. Body misjudged its dimension in water because water is a perfect liar about dimension. Stuck. The other stayed. Of course the other stayed. The air did what air does when it is assigned to two people and a problem. It left. The cave, honest if not kind, accepted the gift and kept it on a shelf where only the patient go. Local divers argued about whether the foot wedged in limestone had moved from the original site of death or whether a collapse had made the original site into the site of discovery. The women in town did not argue. They said the gods keep account in rocks and in bones, and that the jungle's green is only the color the dead agree to wear for a time. A small altar appeared at the cenote lip, half Catholic, plastic Madonna in blue with chipped fingers, a rosary, to keep company with 3 stones piled neatly in a triangle and 1 folded paper that said in Spanish, "For the Canadian girl, tell your mother you remember her." Tourists snorkeled in the main pools of other cenotes that summer and said they could feel a hush under the water. They could not have, not really. Hush is an air concept. But they were not wrong. For people who live by procedures, the story became a tool. In briefings now, instructors tell new cavern divers what the sign with the Grim Reaper means. The sign is not a metaphor. It says in English and Spanish that people have died who were as smart as you are. It says do not go if you cannot return blind. It says lines are for followers, not for leaders, and that you are not a leader here. The story of Daniel and Claire follows the warning the way weather follows heat. Divers nod and then, if they're honest, feel something slide into place that will keep them from making an error they do not yet have a name for. When they surface, some of them climb the ladder more grateful than they expected to be for a ladder. Back in Canada, the story turned into a winter thing. Someone would mention it at a dinner, a cousin would ask for details, an uncle would wonder out loud whether this was not simply bad luck, and whether bad luck did not in fact hunt the reasonable and the prepared more often because they stepped into the street more often. Claire's mother kept a drawer with her daughter's camera straps and the rings her fingers wore thin and a single Polaroid of a cenote surface that looks, to the unrescued eye, like a hole in the forest on a day that did not require remembering. Daniel's father took to reading about karst and haloclines and felt relief the day he realized he could not build a model in which 2 people he loved came back if only he asked limestone for a favor with more accurate terms. If there is meaning, it hides better in caves than anywhere else. The Maya had a way of talking about Xibalba that made the dead less ambiguous than the living. A person entered and was weighed, measured, asked to cross rivers of blood and scorpions and darkness. They either proceeded or they did not. It was bureaucratic and honest. Modern people, with our taste for open-endedness and our allergy to certainty that does not cite a source, prefer to keep possibilities alive long after they cease to be probabilities. Caves punish that preference by making the possible and the probable face the same direction. The cenotes are entrances, still. The underworld is not moral anymore, or perhaps its morality is geology. You leave line or you do not. You manage gas or you do not. You turn or you do not. Xibalba has fewer gods now and more gauges, but the math is the same. Somewhere in those tunnels there is still a room where bubbles from an exhalation rise and collect under a vault and hang there forever until an earthquake relieves them of the obligation to stay. Somewhere there is still a fin print that has not yet been erased by flow. Somewhere there is still a rock scar from a tank valve that hit too hard. Somewhere there is a bone not yet seen by light in 9 years or 19, held in a crack that fits it exactly the way certain chairs seem to have been made for one particular body. A diver will see it one day and be older for it, or no one will. And the underground river will carry it eventually to a new room and a new crack, and, finally, to a place where salt learns its old trick of dissolving anything that insists on being an edge. In the years after the discovery, the cenote path grew over twice and was cut back twice by men with machetes who did not argue with leaf or vine, only remodeled it. A municipal official suggested a fence. A farmer suggested that fences cause more curiosity than they cure. The fence was postponed. A new dive shop opened in town with a mural of a diver descending into a shaft of gold light. Underneath, in tiny letters that a certain kind of tourist admires, someone painted "Respect the caves, they do not forgive." A boy who was 6 when the Canadians vanished became a young man in a black wetsuit with a reel and 3 lights and a habit of touching the water before he went in the way his grandmother touched plaster saints. He joined search parties twice for strangers and once for a man whose wife he had known since school. He learned to move less water than a fish. He learned to say no softly to people who had flown too far to hear it loudly. Every story in Yucatan has an altar and a ledger. In a small church in Tulum, a glass case holds offerings that have accumulated beneath original intentions. Candles, a diver's cookie, a photograph of a woman in a red dress smiling at whoever stood behind the camera, a shell that looks as if it has been underwater for centuries and may have been in a drawer instead. A piece of paper says, "Gracias por regresar," and nobody could tell you who exactly is being thanked for returning or what returned. In a government office in Felipe Carrillo Puerto, there is a file with 2 paper clips and a list of names and dates, and a line that reads "bodies unrecovered," and a stick-on note that says in Spanish, "Family calls January each year." People do what people can to keep faith with the dead. They write, they call, they leave things near water, they tell stories in a responsible voice to people who might otherwise buy a flashlight and a ticket and nothing else. If you need a moral, professionals will give you one. Rope saves, air lies, training is cheaper than funerals. Turn when your gauge tells you even if your heart has not yet heard the sentence. If you need poetry, the jungle supplies it without charging. Roots that drink from black water with the patience of saints. Bats that chatter like gossip about those who will not be gossiped about again. A corridor of stalactites that has been making its point drip by drip since before names were an invention. If you need an ending, the caves will not sell you one. They will lend you one for a time, and then take it back in the way libraries used to do before grace periods softened us all. Daniel and Claire descended together into a room that was older than cities, and the world that still had use for them waited for them on a surface that did not know it was a surface. The earth kept them. 9 years later, it returned a single fragment, enough to teach strangers the vocabulary of caution, enough to let a mother stand in a cemetery and put her palm on a stone that had been waiting for a weight other than rain. Somewhere in the tunnels, a man whose name is on that stone remains in a geography that does not care for names. The cenotes go on breathing without lungs. The jungle keeps throwing a green roof over every problem it is asked to shade. Divers tie lines and hum under their breath and count thirds and do not kick the floor and do not scrape the ceiling and do not confuse stillness with permission. People who come to Yucatan take photographs of light and water and tell each other that the images look like entrances to another world. They are right. Entrances, plural. Whether there is a door on the other side depends on how much air you can carry and whether the hand that reaches for you is attached to someone who is owed a return.